Hello everyone, Amy R here with Prairie Paper and Ink. I have another couple cards for you guys using one of the Stamptember limited edition sets. This set is still in stock, but it is only while supplies last or until the end of September, which is a day away. So I'm scrambling. Anyway, this is the Avery Elle Merry Wreath stamp set. And when I first looked at the set, I was like, oh, it's nice. But I just, seeing all the images in black, I was like, it didn't really appeal to me. But then started thinking about what it would look like stamped, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, oh, this could be a fun set. So I have the set, my cardstock in my Mini Misty, and this is Distress watercolor paper. And I stamped the wreath portion with Vintage Photo Distress Archival ink. There's only 3 sets of archival inks in the Distress colors right now. There's 12 colors. And the beauty of archival ink is it is not water reactive. It's permanent. You can actually stamp it on like different surfaces, etc. And the reason why I wanted to use that today is because I plan on spraying this with water, and everything that I've stamped with the archival inks will not move. It'll still remain crisp. It'll still retain its shape. It won't move. But so that's why I stamped the wreath with the Vintage Photo archival ink, because it'll stay in place. And then the berries and leaves and whatnot in this set, I'm stamping with archival ink first, and then I'm stamping it with regular Distress inks. So again, all the parts that I stamped with the archival inks will remain as they are. All the ones I stamp with the Distress inks, when I spray with water, they will start to like bleed out and move. So it's kind of a fun technique, and it just gives it that little extra something, and it won't turn into a complete blurry, muddy mess if I stamp the whole thing with just Distress inks. All the colors would kind of blend together, the wreath, and it would just end up quite messy. So I just kind of combined both. Like the berries, I would stamp with the archival ink in the Barn Door color, and then I stamped it right on top with the Barn Door Distress ink. And then here I'm spraying it with water, and you can just see all the ones that I stamped with the regular Distress inks start to move. So I'm kind of glad I remembered this fun little technique, and it gives me another use for these archival minis. I just like having them because they're nice to stamp like sentiments and things with, because you get a much clearer, crisper impression than you do with stamping with like regular Distress inks. So after I'd sprayed everything with water, I dried it all quickly with my heat tool because I didn't want the colors to really like spread out too much. I wanted them to be somewhat contained. And then I also wanted this background dry because I want to add a little bit of splatter, of course. And if I had splattered while it was still wet, the splatters would just like blur into everything else. So after it was dry, I'm using my Gansai Tombi Starry colors and the yellow gold, mixing that really well with water, and then splattering it onto this background. And I'm going to let that completely dry. While that was drying, I actually stamped a second background doing the exact same thing. Because again, if I was going to make a bunch of them, like if this was going to be like my main Christmas card, you could totally set this up to, mass produce them if you have a whole bunch to send out. But of course, I do this as a job, so I make them all throughout the year practically. Anyway, while that was drying, I did a second background, and then I also stamped and heat embossed the bow from the set. And I stamped it onto some Desert Storm cardstock, and I heat embossed it with the Wendy Vecchi Carnation Red embossing powder. Love that combination, that red on the Neenah Desert Storm. Love. So then I decided to bring in a little bit of embellishment. So I have my Nouveau Red Berry Glossy crystal drops. And I actually went right over the stamped berries and then added a few little, red dots here and there. It just gives it that extra dimension and shine. By this point, everything is completely dry as well. And I did this step now because I was working on these kind of late at night, and this way I could set everything aside and let these crystal drops completely dry overnight. So I just went around, added them to the stamp berries, and then just added random little like freestanding red Nouveau drop berries as well, just to kind of tie it all together. So I did that with both panels. And then I lightly tapped both of these. I've shown in other videos, I will like really give them a good thwack. If you really want them to smooth out and look more like enamel dots, you just gotta, put some effort into it. But I just lightly tap these just to smooth them out a little bit, but I wanted that dimension because that really gives them that extra something. So very lightly tapped them just to smooth them out a tiny bit, and then set both of these aside to dry completely overnight. So once they were dry, I actually ended up trimming down these panels to slightly smaller than the A2 size they come in. And then I'm putting them back into my Mini MISTI, and I'm building one of the sentiments using some of the words from that Merry Wreath stamp set. So I get the sentiment set up in my Mini MISTI here, use my anti-static powder tool, brushed off the excess, and then I am going to stamp the sentiment with Simon's clear embossing ink right into the center here. And then the sentiments I'm going to heat emboss with Simon's detailed gold embossing powder, just kind of bring in all the gold with the splatter and whatnot. So coat the sentiment with the gold embossing powder, then I melt that with my heat tool, and then I can just repeat the process with the second card. So again, this is where if I was mastering, I would do, over and over and over again, like do all the same steps at the same time, and everything just goes quicker. So melted that with my heat tool, and since the sentiment's set up in my Mini MISTI, I just stuck the second panel in there and did the exact same thing. So anti-static powder tool, brushed off the excess, inked up the stamp, stamped it, coated it with the embossing powder, melted that with my heat tool, and we're good to go. So then once I got all that done, I actually pulled out my white gel pen and just added, drew right on those crystal drops because they're completely dry at this point. I just drew little highlights on those and then added a few little white dots here and there among the wreath. It's just a subtle little extra. You could skip this step if you wanted, but I just thought it kind of added something to it. So went along, added those little highlights, little dots, and then I'm going to build my card bases here, which is more Neenah Desert Storm cardstock. I just cut a sheet of it in half, and then I'm scoring it at 5.5. So these are top folding A2 sized cards. Once I have my card bases made, I want to stamp the insides of both of these. So I'm going to set them up in my Mini MISTI again, and then I'm going to use more of the sentiments from the Merry Wreath stamp set. And I'm going to pull out my Simon grid transparency since I'm lining up multiple stamps. I always forget I have this for whatever reason. It's convenient. So use that so I can line up the stamp so it says "Have a Merry Christmas." That way I can now stamp this on the inside of the card. I'm going to use the anti-static powder tool, and I'm going to heat emboss this with that carnation embossing powder because it was so perfect for the bow, and I just love that shade of red and this embossing powder because it's so solid and bright on that Desert Storm color. It's just so did that with the sentiment. Once it was heat embossed, I ended up stamping the little berry image and the leaves again with those archival inks, the Barn Door and the Peeled Paint archival inks, just to kind of finish off the inside. And of course, I would repeat this process with the second card base while everything's lined up, etc. So once my card bases are heat embossed and stamped, I need to adhere the card fronts to them. So I coated the backs of these with Simon's Big Mama foam tape because they're a little bit warped from a lot spraying and heat embossing and whatnot. So this just really adheres it down. Plus it gives it that little bit of dimension without making them too bulky. So adhered that down, and then I coated the backs of the bows with that same Big Mama foam tape as well, just to pop it up with that little bit of dimension, and then press those into place. And then as a final little bit of embellishment, I had to add some bling because the gold splatter wasn't enough. I needed a little bit more. So I pulled out my Studio Caudia golden crystals and just kind of spread those out around each of these wreaths and adhered them into place with my craft tacky glue. Just picking them up with my jewel picker, press them into place. Once that was done, these cards were finished. Now, like I mentioned, this stamp set is limited edition. It is literally only available for another 36-ish hours or while supplies last. I will have a link to it in the description box below, as well as on my blog, so you can check that out if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting. I really, really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!